All right, so let's take a closer look at how racial bias can actually manifest into racist or discriminatory behaviors in the US today. So while the KKK, neo Nazis, and other openly racist groups and people still exist, the majority of racist discriminatory acts today are a lot more subtle and less overt, which again makes them even more dangerous in our society because it's easier for people to not recognize the racial bias that they have, which results in discriminatory behaviors. So, for example, in the previous presentation, we talked a little bit about how media headlines enhance certain stereotypes when a person of color commits a crime in comparison to when a white person commits similar crimes. So, we looked at the two images on the left and in the center. Another good example is that oftentimes when white people are accused of murder or rape or other crimes, the way they get portrayed in the media is often just as a white person who's an anomaly, right? And typically innocent white person who kind of went against the mold and engaged in a violent or deviant behavior. This particular image on the right here shows a media headline for a recent mass shooting that took place in a movie theater. The perpetrator of the crime was a white man, but since he was young and from a relatively affluent upbringing, the way he got portrayed as being a deviant or a criminal is very different than if the shooter would have been a person of color. Also, there's this phenomenon called racial steering, which is essentially when real estate agents direct prospective homeowners either towards or away certain neighborhoods based on their race. And this is something that you'll notice if you look at the racial demography map for virtually any large city in the United States. It's pretty clear to see how people get organized and placed in certain neighborhoods based off their race. I recently moved to Texas from Milwaukee. This is the racial demography map for the city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And Milwaukee is consistently one of the most racially segregated cities in the United States. So if you look at this map here, the sections that are in blue, blue dots, represent white people. The orange dots represent Hispanic or Latino individuals, and the green dots represent African American individuals. So you can see how clearly the racial lines are drawn in this map, right? It's almost, I mean, clear lines and boundaries designating which neighborhoods are predominantly white versus African American versus Latino. And what studies consistently find is that a large reason for this is that when individuals reach out to real estate agents to view homes in certain properties, real estate agents will intentionally show people homes in neighborhoods that are predominantly surrounded by people of their own color. So for example, when I moved to Milwaukee, I unbeknownst to me, reached out to a real estate agent to help me search for a home. And all of the houses she showed me were in this particular subregion in the bottom right-hand corner of the map here. In these kind of very white dominated suburban areas. I actually had requested to see a few homes that were on the north side of Milwaukee because the property values were significantly lower in this area, so I could afford a lot more house on my budget. And she was very reluctant to show me any homes up there because as the way she put it, she's not from that part of the city. She's not familiar with that part of the city. And at the time, I didn't realize that there was some pretty severe racial segregation happening in the city of Milwaukee, and the homes that I had suggested we look at were predominantly in African American neighborhoods, and she was very uncomfortable to show me those homes. So it was just my own firsthand experience with how this racial steering takes place. And again, I'm not saying my real estate agent was racist, but definitely she had racial bias. You know, she was more familiar with the south side of Milwaukee, predominantly in these white suburban areas, and so that's where the homes she showed me were, and that's eventually where I ended up purchasing a house. So racial steering is one way that racial bias manifests into discriminatory acts. Another practice is called redlining, and that's where bank lenders, financial advisors will routinely refuse mortgages for households and businesses that are located in predominantly minority communities. So there's a lot of evidence, a lot of studies have been conducted that show that bank lenders have racial bias against racial minorities. This data is from one particular study that was conducted relatively recently. And what they found is that even when people of color made more than average income, they were still more likely to be denied a mortgage, right, to purchase a home in comparison to white people. So there's 3 bars on the left here show the percentage of applicants from this study who were denied a mortgage loan based off their race, where they made less than the average income for what was in the sample. And you can see only 15% of white people in this sample who made less than what was average for in terms of the income for the people were denied a mortgage, but 25% of Latinos were denied a mortgage, and 30% of African Americans were denied a mortgage if they made less than the average or median income. But even when people of color in this particular study made higher than the average income or higher than the median income, they were still the same, 30 and 26% respectively for African Americans and Latinos. 30 to 26% of them were still denied mortgages, even when they made higher than what was average of people in this particular study. And as you can see, for white people, it decreased, which is what we would expect. If you have a higher income than what's average, you would probably be more likely to be approved for a mortgage or a loan, but that was not the case for African Americans and Latinos in this particular study. Furthermore, even when African Americans and Latinos made higher than the average income and were approved for loans, they were still being charged significantly higher interest rates on those loans, right? Look at that, 43% of African American applicants were charged higher interest rates, right? Comparatively, only 14% of white people got charged a higher interest rate if they made higher than the average income. So again, these are just subtle ways that show the power of racism and how it's built into the fabric of our society today. And this is likely because there's these racial stereotypes out there that people of color are poor in comparison to white people, and therefore that they might be less likely to actually pay their mortgage payments on time. And these subconscious racial biases that people such as real estate agents and bankers and financial advisors have really profound consequences on the experiences of people of color. Okay? Employers are less likely to hire people of color than white people. On one of the previous presentations, when I discussed a few of the distinct ways racism operates in our society today, we talked about studies that show that, again, even when identical resumes are sent out to employers, exact same qualifications on these resumes, the only thing that's different is the name on the resume. If the resume has a white sounding name, that person's more likely to get offered a job than if the resume has a black sounding name. All right, so it's important to note that racial discrimination in employment and housing is technically illegal in the United States. It is illegal to discriminate in education and in housing because of race. Yet, study after study shows that racism still affects the experiences of people in our society today. So that's another important thing to recognize. Like I said, people often think that, oh, well, slavery was abolished, years ago. We had the civil rights movement that made it illegal to discriminate in employment and in housing. So racism is no longer an issue in our society today. But what study after study shows is that it still is. And that's because we still have these racial biases in our society. This is just one more example of how we can look at how racism gets mapped onto the lived experiences of people. These are maps from the city of Chicago here. And what you'll see on this far left map, which is green in color, this shows the property values of different neighborhoods in Chicago. And the darker the green is, the higher the property values are, all right? And now what you can see here is that, particularly in the northeast side of Chicago, this area is called the Gold Coast, up against the coast of Lake Michigan here. This is a predominantly very wealthy part of Chicago, right? And you can see that by the dark green squares. The south side of Chicago, however, is far lower in socioeconomic status, and you can tell, look how pale these particular neighborhoods are in comparison to the deep dark green, rich neighborhoods in the Gold Coast, or the northern part of Chicago. And now why this is important is that we can see that property values pretty clearly map on top of quality of schools in these neighborhoods as well. So in this particular map with the purple neighborhoods, the darker the purple is, the higher the quality of schools, the better the education is. The lighter color purple areas represent poor quality schools. And what you can see, like I said, if you laid these maps on top of each other, they would almost perfectly align. The neighborhoods with higher property values have higher quality schools, and that's because for public schools, the amount of funding they receive is directly related to the property values, the taxes, the income tax that you pay on property values in your neighborhood. So the richer the neighborhood is, the more money the school gets, which has a direct result in the quality of education that students receive. Now, this third map with the blue shows again Chicago, but this time crime rates. And in this case, the dark blue neighborhoods have the highest crime rates, light blue neighborhoods, the lowest crime rates. So again, we could literally line these three maps right on top of each other. And what we would see if we did that is that the higher the property values are in the neighborhood results in higher quality schools and also results in lower crime rates, right? Now, we'll talk more about crime and education later in the semester, but what you'll find interesting when we discuss that is, as was mentioned earlier, students of color are more likely to be expelled and suspended in comparison to their white counterparts. And when students get expelled or suspended, if they're not able to go to school, they're more likely to engage in criminal behavior, such as joining a gang. Also, if you live in a poor neighborhood with lower property values, it's a good indication of socioeconomic status. People of color are more likely to engage in criminal activity, for example, such as drug dealing, like I said, associated with entering a gang because they're not able to achieve upward social mobility at the same rates as white people due to institutionalized racism. Things like getting kicked out of school at higher rates, being less likely to be hired for regular paying jobs, which results in them again engaging in higher levels of criminal activity. Now, this last map over here, which is a little different color, is again a racial demographic map of Chicago. And what you can see in the south side of Chicago, what race predominantly occupies these poor, low property value, poorly educated, high crime rate neighborhoods? Well, it's African American people. African American people and Hispanics predominantly occupying the south side of Chicago. Now, this isn't to say that because they're black, they're more likely to engage in crime. Rather, what the data shows is that if you live in a poor neighborhood, if you receive poor education, you are more likely to engage in criminal activity, and you are more likely to receive poor education and live in a poor neighborhood if you are a person of color due to the institutionalized racism in our society that affects people of color from having the same opportunities for upward social mobility as white people. All right. So this is why it's important that we understand the implications that racial bias have in our lives, because they do have very real, tangible consequences. All right. So in the final video, we're going to get into the sociological perspectives on race, and then we will also talk about the important concept of white privilege and what we can do specifically as white people to help get rid of racism and racial bias in our societies.